in Mark chapter 7 today. Mark chapter 7, as we continue our work through the book of Mark. If you, hopefully on your way in, were given, or you have saw, maybe not were given, but you saw a table here to the left with a bunch of Easter invites. Those are really cool colors and really nice to look at, but the purchase of them is for you to take with you and put 2 or 3 in your car. Pray every day that God would give you opportunity to share an Easter invite with somebody that he places in your path. So I encourage you and challenge you to do that. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt like an outsider in an environment, in a place where you're somewhere, but you just feel like, man, everybody else has got this thing in common, but I'm just kind of on the outside? Maybe this year you went to a Super Bowl party and everybody's way into the Super Bowl and you could care less, right? You could care less, and it just seems like everybody has this thing in common, but you're just kind of on the outside. Or maybe you got drugged to a concert that you didn't really want to go to, and you go to this concert and you know 0 songs by the artist, and everyone seems to be singing along, and you're going, I've never heard any of this stuff in my life. I just feel like an outsider. Or maybe when you first started dating your spouse, and they took you to a family event, right? Remember the awkward? It's a massive family event, and you roll up with this person, and you feel, man, I'm an outsider here. Everybody has these things in common, and yet here I'm just kind of on the outskirts. I'm on the outside. When I went to college, I remember there was a period of time where I just felt completely like an outsider. My roommate, little questionnaire came in the mail, and I wasn't home, so my mom filled it out. And so I get to college, and I have 2 roommates that would have gotten along great with my mom, just not great with me. They were like the kids my mom wished she would have had. They were studious. They were both top of their class. I was not. They were both musical. They both were in the choir. I was not. They both could play instruments. I could not. They just were different than me in a ton of ways. And even in my own dorm, I kind of felt like an outsider. I felt like there's all this in common, and then there was me. Today, we're going to come across somebody in Scripture who's an outsider. An outsider in regards to every single person that Jesus interacted with up to this point. We're going to come into contact with somebody who's different than all of them, and they are an outsider. They're an outsider primarily because everybody he's come in contact with and everyone he's interacted with up to this point is a Jew. And now we're going to see a Gentile enter the picture. And they're going to be and feel like an outsider. And not only going to feel like an outsider, Jesus is going to say some things that are kind of some difficult things Jesus says that would even make them feel more like an outsider. So let's go to Mark chapter 7, verse 24. He says, he got up and departed from there and went to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. So Jesus wants to get away. He wants to take a break. He wants to kind of just pull away from the crowd. So he goes and he leaves for the very first time. He leaves Israel. And he goes into a home thinking, okay, it's here that I'm going to chill out for a while. It's here I'm going to kind of rest for a while. It said instead immediately. There it is, Mark's favorite word. We've said before 42 times in this book, he's going to use this word immediately. Immediately, after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. This woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now let's stop right here just for a moment. She was a Phoenician woman, a Gentile, a pagan. We've just been talking over the last 2 weeks about this debate and dialogue that's happening between Jesus and the Pharisees and Jesus and the crowd. And here's at the heart of the debate. What makes a person clean versus unclean? Because in the law of Leviticus, there are various things that could make someone unclean. And this debate is happening, this clean versus unclean debate. It starts with the disciples not washing their hands and goes on to a debate or a conversation Jesus has with the crowd in which he says this, it's not from the outside by which a man is defiled. A man is defiled by what's on the inside that works its way out. See, our defilement is not an exterior problem, it's an interior problem. It's a heart issue. That our hearts are defiled, our hearts are corrupt, our hearts are sinful and wicked. And now we're going to go to what someone ingests or something touches that makes him unclean, to now there's an individual. But see, for Jewish people, a Gentile person and contact with that person would make them unclean. Right? It's God's way to separate out this, that he would have it for himself a distinct people. But Jesus goes into this to the place of Tyre, and he meets this woman who comes really by force to meet with Jesus. And she was a Gentile. She was a pagan. She was a woman. Those three things alone, she wouldn't approach a Jewish person, much less a rabbi, but yet she approaches Jesus. And in verse 27, Jesus is going to say something that sounds on the surface like a really big insult. Look what he says. He said to her, let the children, so she comes and says, hey, my daughter is possessed by a demon. Will you please cast out the demon? And here's what he says. Listen to what he says. Let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to dogs. You're going, wait a minute, did Jesus just call this woman a dog? Yes, he did. And so we see some tension here. Like, what is happening? What is Jesus communicating by this? Now, first of all, the word dog here, there's two Greek words you could use for dog. One would be one that would indicate an animal that just kind of runs the street. They are dirty. They just eat what they can. They're dangerous. Like, they're the dogs are just kind of everywhere running amok on the streets. Right? Maybe you don't have a lot of those in your neighborhood. Okay. When you take mission trips to various places, you will find dogs. They'll just run the streets. And then there's a separate word for dog, that a Greek word. The one Jesus used here is the one that would be more like the word puppy, like domesticated, like this dog is in the house, right? And so I want you to think through that for just a moment. That the idea of, hey, that he's talking about this animal that's brought into your home. Raise your hand, you got a dog. Right? Don't worry, I'm not going to embarrass you. A lot of people, right? I once had a guy come to my house to do some work, and I said, hey, we've got a dog around back. He said, don't worry, 70% of homeowners have dogs. I understand. And then my dog bit him. It was great. But anyway, I mean, it was a German Shepherd. We had a big sign, beware of dog. He was good. No, he wasn't. And so anyway, it's just a dog. It's like a puppy. It's a pet. And he's saying, here's what happens. In a household, isn't this the order? If you have a dog, if you're prone people, raise your hand, and you have kids, wouldn't this be the way it would go? You would fix a meal, you would give that meal to your children, and to what was left over that the children didn't eat, you would give to the dog, right? Okay, makes sense. You wouldn't reverse the order. You wouldn't say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let the dogs eat first, and then what the dogs don't eat, we'll give to our kids. What's he saying here? What's Jesus communicating here? Matthew helps us understand what he's communicating, because Matthew has the same account. But here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I have come first for the Jew. And then after that, then we'll get to the Gentile. But it's I've come primarily first for the Jews, and then after my life, my death, my resurrection, I will then give this mission to the disciples, and it will be the disciples that go to the nations. So the Gentiles will get the gospel, but they will only get the gospel after the Jews. You say, well, that sounds offensive. She ought to be offended by that. Well, we look at the ministry of Paul. When you read the book of Acts, Paul goes into a city. Where's the first place Paul goes? He doesn't go first to the marketplace. He always goes first to the synagogue, right? First to the Jews. And then where? Then to the marketplace. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, we read this. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Right? Why are we not ashamed of the gospel? For it is the power of God for salvation, as Paul writing, to everyone who believes, first for the Jew and also for the Greek. And so this is what Jesus is communicating to her. And here's the deal. She could have well, forget it. Just leave my daughter, my demon-possessed daughter alone, Jesus. I'm out of here. But no, she knew that her situation was so desperate. She needs Jesus to act. And here's the crazy thing. He says this parable to her. And here's what happens for the first time in the book of Mark. The first time in the book of Mark, someone understands the parable of Jesus without explanation. And it's this outsider. It's this pagan woman who hears it, and she gets it. And because she understands her own condition and she understands her own life, she doesn't get mad. She doesn't push back. But she gently pushes back. against Jesus. Look at the next verse. But she replied, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She's saying, but look, I'm going to get something. Like if I'm the dog and you're the owner, then I know that you are good and we'll get something. Then he told her, because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Matthew says this about the woman. He says, oh, woman of great faith. He calls her a woman of great faith. Why? Because she heard and she understood and she responds to that which she's heard in faith to who Jesus is and what he has said. When she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed and the demon was gone. Incredible. Let's continue verse 31. Again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by the way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the region of Decapolis, and they brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hand on him. So they brought to him. Who is they? We don't know. We see they in various places in Mark. They brought a man to Jesus. Where at? Mark chapter 2. When they brought a paralyzed man to Jesus and dug a hole in the roof and laid him down. And now they, a different they, are bringing this man who cannot hear and cannot speak to Jesus. After putting, and this gets a little strange here, after putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him this Arabic word, epiphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately, there it is again, his eyes were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak clearly. He ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. This is this part again where Jesus is saying, hey, when you go out, don't tell anyone what's happened here. Why does he do that? Because he is addressing the inevitable misunderstanding that would happen if they communicated it. And they would share a report of the miracle, and with the sharing of the report, they would spread the wrong conclusions about who Jesus is. And so Jesus says, hey, just don't tell anybody. Go out, but don't tell anyone. And then verse 37, but the more he ordered it, the more they proclaimed it. So they just went out and did it anyway. They were extremely astonished and said, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. They were extremely astonished. Maybe your Bible says they were astonished beyond measure. They had astonishment that couldn't be quantified. Like if I were to ask you, those are basketball fans in the room, how surprised are you that NC State won the ACC tournament and 1 to 10, and you say an 11? You are beyond astonished, right? You have an astonishment that can't be quantified. It cannot be quantified, and that's what's happening here. And then verse 38, he says, oh, about Jesus, what does he do? He does everything well. He does everything well. We have these two incredible accounts. And I struggled this week on how to connect these two outsider stories. That there's so much we can learn here and so much we can draw from and so much we can apply. And after wrestling for a while this week, here's what I decided to come back to. I decided to come back to the three questions that have kind of guided us through this study. As we've gone through the book of Mark, we've sought to ask three questions. Who is Jesus? Why did Jesus come? And what does it look like to follow him? Right? As we've gone, we've said if we'll study Mark together, we believe that if we get to the end of chapter 16 of Mark, you will walk away with the answer to these three questions. Who is Jesus? Why did he come? And what's it look like to follow him? And as I was wrestling this week to connect these two stories that are similar but yet very different, I went to our questions and I read the text again and go, well, look at that. All three questions answered in 14 verses. So let's look at the questions. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And what we see from verses 24 through 37, this is what we see. Jesus is the Son of Man who displays his power over death, demons, and deafness. This is who Jesus is. So when you read these verses and you were to walk away with the question, who is Jesus? You'd say Jesus is the Son of Man who declares his power over death, demons, and deafness. Son of Man is this term that the book of Mark uses repeatedly for Jesus, more than any other book, that really the heart of this terminology for who Jesus is to explain and to help us see both his authority and lordship on earth. That there is nothing that is not below Jesus. There is nothing that he is not control over, that he is not Lord over, that he does not have authority over. And as you read through the book of Mark, you're going to see this every single page. Matter of fact, it kind of feels like this when you read the book of Mark. It kind of feels like every chapter has a story in it that starts the same way. Right? It's like the idea, somebody say, well, stop me if you've heard this one before. Right? And if the book of Mark, it's kind of like, stop me if you've heard this. There was a crowd. And there was Jesus. And Jesus was preaching and teaching. And then a person either came to Jesus on their own or was brought to Jesus by friends who had a deep need. Jesus then in turn meets the need, and the person walks away changed through his encounter with Jesus. You heard that one yet? Yeah, like every week, right? To be honest, it's this repetition of these encounters with Jesus that actually, as I've considered preaching through Gospels, I've kind of always chose John instead of Mark, or chose Luke instead of Mark, because I just felt like Mark just had some repetition. It wasn't through personal study of doing a deeper study of Mark that I recognized that, man, each of these encounters teaches something new about Jesus. And though on the outside they may look very similar, when you get to the root of what's happening, who's involved or where it takes place, man, each encounter is teaching us something new about who Jesus is. And today we're reminded he is the Son of Man, authority and lordship over all. Everything under his feet. And he has the power over demons, death, and deafness. All right, so second question, why did he come? Why did he come? Why did he come? Jesus came to make a way for outsiders to become insiders. Jesus came to make a way for outsiders to become insiders, because what we see in the account of this woman is a woman who's on the outside come to the inside. A woman who's stuck on the fringes on the outside come to the inside with Jesus. There are several things we want to notice about this woman that help us understand how to approach Jesus. How that we might become an outsider who would become an insider in response to him. The first thing that we see is her desperation, that she approaches Jesus desperately. She knew her daughter was in trouble. She knew Jesus could heal him. She knew that without Jesus, her daughter would continue to lay in the bed and be tormented. She knew that without Jesus, her daughter would just be dangerous, that her life without Jesus would be trouble, hardship, difficulty, mocking, that she would be the talk of the town, and not in a good way, because her daughter would be the one, the one, the mom of the demon-possessed girl. But with Jesus, everything changed. And because of that, she goes to him, and she goes to him desperate. She goes to him desperate. Tim Keller, in his book, The King's Cross, he says this in commenting on this text. He says, there are cowards, there are regular people, there are heroes, and then there are parents. Parents are not really on the spectrum from cowardice to courage, because if your child is in jeopardy, you simply do what it takes to save her. There's an old movie called John Q. I love the movie John Q, and you think, well, don't ruin it for me. Look, I got a rule. If I bought it on VHS tape, I'm allowed to spoil the ending, okay? So that's just the way it rolls, okay? So in 22 years ago, this movie John Q came out. And I used to have it on VHS tape. I looked for it, was asking Jen for it. Somehow it got thrown away. Maybe it got thrown out with the VCR. Who knows? So it could have been in there, actually in the spot. But in the movie, John Q, Denzel Washington's son needs a heart transplant. And he gets denied the heart transplant by insurance, and he doesn't have the financial resources to pay for a heart transplant. And so unless something else changes, Denzel Washington's son's going to die. So Denzel Washington, in the movie John Q, he goes into the hospital, and he holds the emergency room hostage until his son gets a heart transplant. He says to them, I don't think you understand. My son's not going to die in here. My son's walking out of here. I don't think you get it. At one point, he even tells him, lays down on the bed and says, look, take my heart. Take my heart out of me and place it into my son. What is all this an example of? It's an example of a desperate parent who desires to save their child. Here's a desperate mom who desires to save her daughter, and she goes to Jesus in pure desperation, understanding this, that she cannot save her. For us to move from outsiders to insiders, it begins with a desperation where you and I come to an understanding of this. You cannot save yourself. You cannot save yourself. You cannot save you. You through your actions, you through your behaviors, you through your good deeds cannot, in a way, work your way into salvation, into a way of righteous standing before a holy God. You can't do it. And so salvation begins outside from inside, begins with us in a place of desperation. But the second thing we know about this woman who comes to be an outsider to an insider is she comes to the Lord humbly. She's not saying, Lord, give me what I deserve based on my goodness. She's saying, Lord, give me what I don't deserve based on your goodness. And when he calls her a dog, she doesn't push back and say, that's not who I am. She's like, yeah, I don't deserve this. But God, even a dog of the family gets some crumbs. God, and your crumbs are enough. The crumbs that you would give would be enough to rescue my daughter. So God, on behalf of my daughter, Jesus, on behalf of my daughter, please act. And she comes humble. She doesn't come puffed up. She doesn't come claiming her own goodness. She doesn't come from a place of, well, hey, here's what I deserve. Jesus, it's me. And I'm coming to tell you this is what I think you ought to give me based on what I've done. No, she comes in humility, understanding it's not her goodness that's going to merit a response from Jesus. It's his goodness. And in the same way, when we come to God, we come desperately, but we also come humbly. We don't come demanding God save us based on our merit, but we come with a recognition of knowing we don't deserve the salvation that comes from knowing him. And then the third thing, that she comes in faith. She comes in a trusting faith. She says, hey, get up, go home. And she goes home and she finds her daughter lying calm on the bed. But when Jesus says, go home, here's the crazy thing. She just goes home. Right? Like wouldn't you want Jesus to come with you? Because what if it didn't take the first time? What if Jesus needs hands? What if he needs to put hands on the lady? He's going to have to put hands on the deaf guy. Why don't he have to put hands on the demon-possessed girl? Jesus, come with me. Here's the amazing thing. When he says, get up, she gets up. And she goes home and finds her daughter just as Jesus said she would. See, our salvation comes through Jesus. Now, here's the deal. We live on this side of the cross. She was on that side of the cross. We live on this side of the cross. She did not have the ultimate revelation of God's love and power towards us, but we do. We've got John 3:16. For God so loved the world that whosoever, that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Like the woman, we cannot trust our actions to save us. Like her, we are outsiders. And the word has come to us as the word came to her. And Christ met her needs. And Christ can meet your needs. Christ can heal your heart. Christ can transform you. So it brings us to the last question. What's it look like to follow him? What does it look like to follow him? So we've got this, who is Jesus? He is the Son of Man who displays his power over demons, death, and deafness. Why did he come? He came so that you and I can move from the outside to the inside in relationship to God. What does it look like to following him? Following looks like adopting his mission and ministry in the world. That's what it looks like to follow him. And we've got this model of it here starting in verse 31. He leaves the woman and he goes to Decapolis and he meets someone and they introduce him to his friend. And again, friends are incredible. We all need friends like this. But in the encounter, we're going to see this picture of what it looks like for us to adopt the mission and ministry of Jesus. And the way he interacts with this person is just a great template for us as followers of Jesus interacting in the world. Let's walk through it and see what he does. First thing he does, he goes, that they bring him, first he pulls him aside. He's a human being, not a spectacle. He pulls him aside, takes him away from the crowd. Right, so what's he do? He looks up. He took him away from the crowd in private, put his fingers in the man's ears. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And spitting, he touched his tongue, looking to heaven. First thing, and if we're going to adopt the ministry and mission of Jesus, we understand there's a deep dependence of us to God. There's this deep dependence from us to God, that we are dependent upon God to move in us. And I want you to actually think about ways that God may be calling you to minister to those around you. Do you seek your dependence upon him? Or do you go, I can't enter that conversation. I don't know what I'm going to say. If I start talking about Jesus, they're going to ask hard questions. So I'm not going to do it. What are ways that in the ministry and mission of Jesus you bring into your life that you can live dependent upon him? That you're completely dependent on him for the ministry and mission that he calls you to. So he looks up to God. Second thing, he responds with compassion. He responds with compassion. There's this deep sigh, the Bible says. Now think about it. You got your fingers in his ears? Right? He's about to hear. Like you're about to restore this man's hearing. Wouldn't you be smiling? Right? Stick your fingers in his ear like, you're not going to believe this, man. Here we go. No, there's a deep sigh. Why? Many commentators, when they write on this account, they said that there's a belief that this man wasn't born with deafness, and somehow he became deaf. He used to be able to speak, but now he can't speak well. And Jesus, with a sign of compassion towards the man and towards all that he's walked through and all the difficulty and heartache and difficult things he's experienced, he just looks him in the eye and he just sighs. He just feels compassion for the man. Who is it in your life that you can feel compassion towards? Who is it in your life that you've maybe passed by where God has given you opportunities to show compassion towards them, but because of your schedule, because of your own agenda, you've just missed out on opportunities to be compassionate to the needs of those around you. Jen's got a sweatshirt that she'll wear occasionally, and it just says, look out for the left out. And I just see Jesus with his fingers in this guy's ears, this deep sigh as his way of loving this man. There's a story I read this week about an old news anchor named Hugh Rudd. He was a CBS news guy 60 years ago. And he tells a story about he does the nightly news, the late night news, and he gets a taxi, and the taxi takes him from the studio to his home, and he gets out of the taxi, and as soon as he does, these four men pull guns on him and surround him right outside of his home. They rob him, he gives them everything that they have, and then they take the ends of their pistols, and they begin beating him over the head. He falls into the side street of the east side of New York. Semi-conscious, he lays there, and he remembers just seeing the feet of people just consistently walk past him. Some people coming home from a night of partying, some people leaving to go to work, but either way, countless number of people just parading right past this man in the gutter of the east side of New York with blood coming out of his head. His wife, when she wakes up and realizes he isn't home, she calls the police. The police find him there 7 hours after the incident. Because person after person walked by him and did nothing and showed no compassion towards his hurting. See, Jesus gives us a model that ought to wake us up to the needs of our world and the deep needs of those around us, to just consider and maybe think about, am I walking past opportunities to be compassionate to people that God has placed in my life? There's a model for ministry here that first says, hey, let's depend on God. Number two, let's show compassion. Number three, he entered into his world. He pulled him from the crowd and he touches him. He touches him. He takes his hands and he puts them into his ears. He takes saliva and he places it onto his tongue as to show him, hey, this is what's about to happen. Right? Your hearing is about to be restored. Your speaking is about to be restored. He enters into his world. And then the last thing he does is he speaks. He speaks. And he says, be opened. Be opened. A guy named Paul Tripp writes this book called Instrument in the Redeemer's Hands, and he says these four things of this ministry of one another and ministry in the world. There's these four words. Here they are. It's love, know, speak, and do. Love, know, speak, do. And we see that modeled by Jesus here. He loves this man. He loves him. He hurts when he hurts. And when this guy rejoices, I bet Jesus was rejoicing. I bet the smile came across his face. I bet as he jumped up and down, Jesus was jumping up and down. He loved him. Second word, know. He heard and he saw and he entered into his world. And this man hurt and Jesus was there hurting with him. And you want to say, what's my model for ministry as I live the mission of Jesus in the world? Number one, you love people. Number two, you get to know people. That means listen. Listen to what's happening in their lives. Walk alongside of them. Weep when they weep. Rejoice when they rejoice. Just love, know people. Speak. After the first two, Jesus speaks. Jesus doesn't roll up and say, be open. No. He enters into his world. He shows compassion. He loves this individual, and then he speaks truth. And so as we model the ministry and mission of Jesus in the world, we love people. We get into their lives. We know their lives. We then speak truth into their life. And then there's do. Jesus says, hey, now that you've experienced this, now go live this way. Do this thing. And as you live out the ministry and mission of Jesus, you begin to love people. You begin to know their life and know their heart. You begin to speak truth in their life. And then that's the point that you begin to disciple and go, dude, now this is what it looks like to follow Jesus. In one account and in 14 verses, we answered all three questions. So where do you sit today? Are you an outsider who's kind of always dependent and thought, man, maybe I can behave my way well enough to get into right standing with God, and today the light bulb's gone off and go, no, I need to come humbly before him. What do you mean Jesus calls me? What do you mean the Bible's going to call me a dog? I'm going to rise up against, I'm going to push back. No. You are sinful, separated from God, with no shot at saving yourself. You're an outsider, but you can be brought in through faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Maybe that's where you need to respond to today. Or maybe you're a believer, you're a follower of Jesus, and you say, hey, you know what, I want to wake up to some ministry and mission that God's put right in front of my face. And today, God's put a name on my heart. He's put a face on my heart of a person I need to show compassion, a person I need to enter into their world to, a person I need to speak truth to and help love and follow Jesus. What's that look like for you practically in your life? Let's consider those things.